Just south of the Massachusetts border, the Connecticut River separates the town of Windsor, Connecticut, from the town of South Windsor, Connecticut. In fact, the river is the reason that there is a South Windsor, Connecticut. Windsor was originally one settlement on both sides of the river, but as the population increased on the east side of the river, the people there formed a separate town called South Windsor. The famous Congregationalist pastor Jonathan Edwards was born in South Windsor in 1703. But in the town of Windsor, just across the river from Jonathan Edwards' birthplace, and just 3 years later, 1706, another man was born who would also be greatly used of God in colonial America. His name was Daniel Marshall. Daniel Marshall was saved when he was 20 years old. He joined the Congregational Church in Windsor, where he was soon made a deacon. In 1742, he married Hannah Drake, and they had a son, Daniel Jr. In 1744, Daniel Marshall heard George Whitefield preach, and from that time on, the defining characteristic of his life was a fervent burden for lost souls. Daniel was not a greatly talented man. He was not highly educated. He was not eloquent. In fact, people who met him described him as a stammerer and not above mediocrity. But he was a man of great holiness and integrity, and he had an earnestness about him that caused him to persevere in all of his efforts. Daniel's wife Hannah died in 1746, and in 1748 he married a young lady named Martha Stearns, the sister of Shubal Stearns, who would later have a historic impact for Christ in the South. In 1750, the Marshalls sold their possessions and moved from Windsor, Connecticut to western New York to preach the gospel to the American Indians. Daniel, Martha, and their children, along with several other Christian families, lived as missionaries among the Mohawk Indians for about 18 months, working to win them to Christ. The Lord used them to see many souls saved there. Then, when the French and Indian War began, the Marshalls knew they needed to move their family to a place of safety. They eventually wound up in Winchester, Virginia, and started attending a Baptist church there. As they compared the teachings of the church to the scriptures, they became convinced that the doctrine of the Baptists was the doctrine of the Bible. Daniel and Martha Marshall were baptized by immersion and became members of the Baptist church. Soon, Daniel was licensed to preach, and he began preaching and winning souls everywhere he went. They moved to North Carolina, and he continued preaching and winning souls there with great success. He started a Baptist church in Abbots Creek, North Carolina, and he was ordained to be their pastor. After several years, he resigned the pastorate at Abbots Creek, and he went into South Carolina and won souls and started churches there. Over the course of 17 years, 14 men were influenced by Daniel Marshall to become Baptist preachers, and he helped start a total of 18 Baptist churches. While he was pastoring in South Carolina, Daniel Marshall occasionally took preaching trips into Georgia. The official church of the colony of Georgia was the Church of England, and it was illegal to hold any kind of religious services in Georgia without the authorization of the Church of England. One Sunday in 1771, when Daniel was 65 years old, he gathered a group of people to hear him preach in a beautiful spot in the parish of St. Paul's. As he was kneeling, opening the service in prayer, a hand patted him on the shoulder. Daniel Marshall looked up to see an officer standing over him. The man said, "You are my prisoner," and he ordered him to appear in court the next morning for the crime of holding an unauthorized church service. Daniel and Martha Marshall showed up in court the next day, and the young constable, Samuel Cartledge, released him without any further consequences. Daniel silently turned to walk away, happy to be free from the charges. But his wife Martha spoke up and loudly rebuked the young man, telling him to flee the wrath to come and be saved from his sins. Several years later, Daniel Marshall would lead Samuel Cartledge to Christ, and when he baptized him, Marshall said, "You are my prisoner and my brother in Christ." Samuel Cartledge was eventually ordained to preach and served the Lord for the rest of his life. In 1772, Daniel Marshall established the Kyoke Baptist Church near Appling, Georgia, which was the first Baptist church in Georgia. He served as the pastor of Kyoke Baptist Church until he died in 1784. At the Marshall Historical Site in Appling, Georgia, there stands a monument which reads, "Daniel Marshall, born in Windsor, Connecticut, 1706. Congregationalist, who became separate Baptist during Great Awakening. Ordained, Abbots Creek, North Carolina, 1757. Leader in establishing Baptist works in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Supported cause of religious liberty. Arrested for preaching in Georgia. Led in establishing Georgia's first continuing Baptist church on the Little Coyote in 1772. Only pastor to remain in Georgia throughout the Revolution. Georgia Baptists are indebted to him for nurturing many men who contributed to the movement's early growth. Christian, your genuine love for the Lord will ignite in your soul a burden for the souls of men, which will drive you to make an eternal impact for Christ. Stay the course.